horror and contempt for the politics and questions of the day, but when perchance it referred to them, it showed itself frankly reactionary, took the side of the Church against the insolence of the freethinkers, of the kings against the peoples, and of all the aristocrats against the vile rabble of the streets. For the rest, as I have just said, the dominant feature of the school of Romanticism was a quasi-complete indifference to politics. Amid the clouds in which it lived could be distinguished two real points: the rapid development of bourgeois materialism and the ungovernable outburst of individual vanities. To understand this romantic literature, the reason for its existence must be sought in the transformation which had been effected in the bosom of the bourgeois class since the Revolution of 1793. From the Renaissance and the Reformation down to the Revolution, the bourgeoisie, if not in Germany, at least in Italy, in France, in Switzerland, in England, in Holland, was the hero and representative of the revolutionary genius of history. From its bosom sprang most of the free thinkers of the 15th century, the religious reformers of the two following centuries, and the apostles of human emancipation, including this time those of Germany, of the past century. It alone, naturally supported by the powerful arm of the people, who had faith in it, made the revolution of 1789 and 93. It proclaimed the downfall of royalty and of the Church, the fraternity of the peoples, the rights of man and of the citizen. Those are its titles to glory. They are immortal. Soon it split. A considerable proportion of the purchasers of national property having become rich, and supporting themselves no longer on the proletariat of the cities, but on the major portion of the peasants of France, these also having become landed proprietors, had no aspiration left but for peace, the re-establishment of public order, and the foundation of a strong and regular government. It therefore welcomed with joy the dictatorship of the first Bonaparte, and although always Voltairean, did not view with displeasure the Concordat with the Pope, and the re-establishment of the official church in France. Religion is so necessary to the people, which means that, satiated themselves, this portion of the bourgeoisie then began to see that it was needful to the maintenance of their situation and the preservation of their newly acquired estates, to appease the unsatisfied hunger of the people by promises of heavenly manna. Then it was that Chateaubriand began to preach. Footnote. It seems to me useful to recall at this point an anecdote, one, by the way, well known and thoroughly authentic, which sheds a very clear light on the personal value of this warmed over of the Catholic beliefs, and on the religious sincerity of that period. Chateaubriand submitted to a publisher a work attacking faith. The publisher called his attention to the fact that atheism had gone out of fashion, that the reading public cared no more for it, and that the demand, on the contrary, was for religious works. Chateaubriand withdrew, but a few months later came back with his Genius of Christianity. End footnote. Napoleon fell, and the Restoration brought back into France the legitimate monarchy, and with it the power of the Church and of the nobles, who regained, if not the whole, at least a considerable portion of their former influence. This reaction threw the bourgeoisie back into the revolution, and with the revolutionary spirit, that of scepticism also was reawakened in it. It set Chateaubriand aside and began to read Voltaire again, but it did not go so far as Diderot. Its debilitated nerves could not stand nourishment so strong. Voltaire, on the contrary, at once a freethinker and a deist, suited it very well. Béranger and P. L. Courier expressed this new tendency perfectly. The God of the good people, and the ideal of the bourgeois king, at once liberal and democratic, sketched against the majestic and thenceforth inoffensive background of the empire's gigantic victories, such was at that period the daily intellectual food of the bourgeoisie of France. Lamartine, to be sure, excited by a vain and ridiculously envious desire to rise to the poetic height of the great Byron, had begun his coldly delirious hymns in honour of the god of the nobles and of the legitimate monarchy, but his songs resounded only in aristocratic salons. The bourgeoisie did not hear them. Béranger was its poet, and Courier was its political writer. The Revolution of July resulted in lifting its tastes. We know that every bourgeois in France carries within him the imperishable type of the bourgeois gentleman, a type which never fails to appear immediately the parvenu acquires a little wealth and power. In 1830 the wealthy bourgeoisie had definitely replaced the old nobility in the seats of power. It naturally tended to establish a new aristocracy, an aristocracy of capital first of all, but also an aristocracy of intellect, of good manners and delicate sentiments. It began to feel religious. This was not, on its part, simply an aping of aristocratic customs. It was also a necessity of its position. The proletariat had rendered it a final service in once more aiding it to overthrow the nobility. The bourgeoisie now had no further need of its cooperation, for it felt itself firmly seated in the shadow of the throne of July, and the alliance with the people, thenceforth useless, began to become inconvenient. It was necessary to remand it to its place, which naturally could not be done without provoking great indignation among the masses. It became necessary to restrain this indignation. In the name of what? In the name of the bourgeois interest, bluntly confessed? That would have been much too cynical. The more unjust and inhuman an interest is, the greater need it has of sanction. Now, where find it, if not in religion, that good protectress of all the well-fed, and the useful consoler of the hungry? And more than ever, the triumphant bourgeoisie saw that religion was indispensable to the people. After having won all its titles to glory in religious, philosophical and political opposition, in protest and in revolution, it at last became the dominant class, and thereby even the defender and preserver of the state, thenceforth the regular institution of the exclusive power of that class. The state is force, and for it, first of all, is the right of force, the triumphant argument of the needle-gun, of the chasse-pot. But man is so singularly constituted that this argument, wholly eloquent as it may appear, is not sufficient in the long run. Some moral sanction or other is absolutely necessary to enforce his respect. Further, this sanction must be at once so simple and so plain that it may convince the masses, who, after having been reduced by the power of the state, must also be induced to morally recognise its right. There are only two ways of convincing the masses of the goodness of any social institution whatever. The first, the only real one, but also the most difficult to adopt, because it implies the abolition of the state, or, in other words, the abolition of the organised political exploitation of the majority by any minority whatsoever, would be the direct and complete satisfaction of the needs and aspirations of the people, which would be equivalent to the complete liquidation of the political and economical existence of the bourgeois class, or, again, to the abolition of the state. Beneficial means for the masses, but detrimental to bourgeois interests, hence it is useless to talk about them. The only way, on the contrary, harmful only to the people, precious in its salvation of bourgeois privileges, is no other than religion. That is the eternal mirage, which leads away the masses in a search for divine treasures, while much more reserved the governing class contents itself with dividing among all its members, very unequally moreover, and always giving most to him who possesses most, the miserable goods of earth and the plunder taken from the people, including their political and social